here who's ever made a piece of clothing? All right, a lot of people, great. So there are three basic steps to constructing a garment: cutting, sewing, and pressing. Which do you guys think is the most skilled step in the process? Which takes the most skill? Tell me.
It's a toss-up between cutting and pressing.
Why?
Cutting and pressing requires a lot of skills, and the cutting and they both were usually done by men. And so that's why it sort of sets it up as what they consider the most skilled.
Well, this is actually part of the answer, right? First, before I say more about this, does anybody want to give a different answer?
I think cutting is the most important part because if you cut it wrong, on the bias or off the bias, an inch too small, an inch too wide, you have nothing to work with. You have nothing to sew.
And the fabric is wasted.
And the fabric is wasted. So economically, it's a very serious job.
Absolutely. So you all are clearly more educated than my students who are trying to become fashion designers themselves. They tend to answer that sewing is the most difficult of these stages. And they're not exactly wrong, because sewing is difficult to do. And sewing used to be perhaps more skilled relative to the other tasks before mass production. When you had to make the piece all on your own, the sewing certainly took the longest time of the three steps. And also, the other steps became more important over time, really for the reasons that you're talking about, right? So first of all, we have this sexism that you were talking about, this association of sewing with women, which makes people assume, oh, it must be the easiest task. Also, when you start ramping up your levels of production, when you cut, you're not usually cutting just one piece of fabric, you're cutting a stack. And so those mistakes and that waste get amplified if you make mistakes. And when you're doing it in mass, if you start pressing wrong, all of the labor that you have done and all of the material that you have used is wasted afterwards. So the relative difficulty of these different tasks kind of changes in the late 1800s as cutting and pressing become more important and more associated with male labor, and the clothing, the sewing is left to women. Mass production starts not because of the invention of the sewing machine, but really because of the invention of standard sizing. This is a story that I love. Without standard sizes, how do you know how to make a garment for somebody who hasn't walked into the store yet? Before that, tailors would measure your body. They would sew something for you. You'd come back and you'd try it on, and it was never right. And then you'd leave again, and they would tailor it for you. And then you'd come back and you'd buy it. So you had to leave and come back a couple of times with a traditional tailor who was working, doing all the different steps in the process. We have some early examples before the Civil War of the move towards mass manufactured clothing. Two particular markets. One for sailors, because sailors don't have time to leave and come back and leave and come back. They're shipping off. So tailors in the port cities of North America, when they made something, often they'd make another copy of it. And they'd just leave a lot in the back, and sailors would show up and try some things on, whatever fit the best they'd walk out with. The other market for ready-made clothing was for slaves in the South, because their masters didn't care if it fit well. So there were a bunch of companies that started making a lot of clothing, not knowing what the size of the bodies were of the people they were making for, and then they sent it off. The turning point, though, is the Civil War. During the Civil War, all of a sudden, we need to make a lot of uniforms really, really fast for a lot of soldiers. And the government decides that it can't have tailors making all these uniforms. So they go and measure a whole bunch of soldiers, and then come up with a standard set of measures for different body types. And that, at least in the United States, is the invention of standard sizing. And that's a conceptual breakthrough that allows people to start really ramping up mass manufacture of clothing. The first step is that standard sizing. The second step is dividing it up into three stages: cutting, sewing, and pressing, and giving those jobs to different people. And then maybe the third step is dividing up the sewing into smaller and smaller pieces. So eventually each worker is just sewing one seam and then passing it on to the next person. And then maybe the last step is we see a bottleneck in the sewing, even when we divide it up into so many different pieces, and we need to apply technology to remove that bottleneck, which inspires the development by many people, not just Isaac Singer, of the sewing machine. So once we have all of these different pieces in place to create a modern garment industry, we have to decide where we're going to do it. And there's two big choices that people sort of accept in the late 1800s. One is outwork. We're going to spread out manufacturing all over the Lower East Side. And someone from the company is going to show up at your door in the tenement with 2 different stacks of fabric, and you're going to sew one seam down the middle of each of these 2 pieces. And when you're done, maybe in a couple of days, that guy's going to come back and he's going to pick up what used to be 2 packages and now is 1, and bring it to another apartment, maybe in a different building, maybe a different street, maybe even a different neighborhood. And they will sew the next seam, and on and on and on. And there's a lot of advantages to doing it this way. You don't have to pay rent. You get a lot of free labor from the kids. You don't have liability if somebody gets hurt or something goes wrong, although even in a factory, liability law is not so good at this time, for the workers at least. And there's flexibility. If one person isn't doing so well on it, you just move that piece of the production to a different apartment. However, there are downsides as well, especially supervision and quality control. And so once some of these garment manufacturers earn enough money, they tend to move away from outwork towards factory work. They build factories where actually in the beginning, the workers have to bring their own sewing machines every day. Sewing machines were really heavy back then. And I like to imagine like the morning when all of these women were carting around and carrying their heavy sewing machines around the neighborhood of the Lower East Side, bringing them over to places like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So eventually, a couple of guys named Blank and Harris collected enough capital that they can start a real factory, and they open it up on the corner of Washington and Green. It's on the top 3 floors of a building, which is called the Ash Building at the time. Although after it burned, I guess the name Ash seemed inappropriate, so they changed it to the Brown Building. And there's various different people working in the building. Some of them are the men doing the cutting and pressing, but the majority of them are women. Some of them are direct employees of the company, and others are contracted labor. So side by side on the same floor, you have employees with different contracts, with different relationships to the company. Some of them are directly employed by Blank and Harris. Others are employed by other people who are brought in to work, and they're getting paid less. And that tension between those 2 groups is a major factor in spurring a strike at the Triangle factory that starts in 1909. There's a bunch of different complaints that people have. One of my favorite complaints is there aren't enough pegs for us to hang our hats on. And it's a sign of dignity to wear a hat in this time. And it's an indignity to have to store your hat under the table, under the sewing machine. And of course, there's lots of other complaints about wages, about conditions, and always about dignity. And so these women go out on strike in 1909. And pretty soon, some other people follow them in other factories on strike. And the strike spreads and spreads. And the International Ladies Garment Workers Union is a little bit unsure about what to do about this strike. They're concerned. It's all men who are running the union, even though it's a union of people who make women's clothing, who are largely female themselves. And there's a big meeting about what to do about this at Cooper Union. And a bunch of the men get up and give speeches about how we don't have a very large strike fund. We don't think that we can last very long if we go on strike. We think we should not call a general strike of all the people making women's clothing in the city. And then a woman named Clara Lemlin gets up and says, I've had enough of this. It's time for us to go on strike. And the room erupts, and everybody agrees, and they make a pledge to each other in Yiddish, and the entire union goes out on strike. This is called the Uprising of the 20,000. And there are pickets all over the city in front of factories. And the bosses have some tricks up their sleeves. One of their tricks is to send prostitutes down onto the line to mix in with the picketers. And then get the cops to arrest everybody as a prostitute. Or they'll get the prostitutes to bring their hat pins with them and start poking the legitimate strikers to start fights, so that the police can then come in and gather everybody and throw everybody in jail. Clara Lemick had actually already been in jail and beaten by the police before she came and gave her famous speech. And one of the ways that the strikers dealt with that was by making connections with rich ladies from uptown, especially Anne Morgan, J.P. Morgan's daughter. And some of these women start coming downtown and joining them on the picket line. Cross-class solidarity among women. And you cannot poke a rich lady with a hat pin. You cannot arrest a rich lady and call her a prostitute. And so some of those strategies that the bosses had been using start not working anymore. And the bosses start saying, well, maybe we should negotiate. And one by one, a lot of these bosses start giving in to the union, signing contracts which give better wages and shorter working hours. In particular, they used to work 6 hours a day, and the new contract says you only have to work half a day on Saturday. We're going to give you the afternoon off. And a lot of different shops sign contracts, but Blank and Harris, the heads of the Triangle Waste Company, do not. They are hardcore activists, hardcore bosses, hardcore anti-union activists, I guess. And they refuse. And that's one of the reasons why 2 years later, when the fire starts on March 25th, 1911, at 4:45 or so, they're all still at work. They only have the top 3 floors of the building. The rest of the building is other factories, and they're all gone because they won the strike. The strike that had started at the Triangle Company. Everybody else benefited from it, and they were gone. And only the people on the top 3 floors remained. The fire started on the 8th floor. We think it was started by somebody dropping a match or a cigarette into the scraps on the floor. It spreads very quickly. It was near the end of the day, so a lot of women had already been gathering up their stuff, getting ready to leave, and a lot of the people on the 8th floor got out just fine. They called up on the switchboard to the 10th floor, which is where the phone operators were for the company. And the phone operators on the 10th floor, they kind of panicked, and they forgot to call back down to the 9th floor to let them know. So as the 8th floor and the 10th floor are evacuating, on the 9th floor, people are going about their day, until the fire has gotten so strong on the 8th floor that it smashes through the windows to get at more oxygen on the outside. Fire can do this, and then smashes back in through the windows on the 9th floor. And it's everywhere. And some people run to a stairwell and try to go down, but they can't reach it, so they go up and get to the roof, and are helped across the transom by a bunch of NYU law students who had been in a class across the way and saw it happen and came, put a ladder across, saved a lot of people's lives. Blank and Harris escaped that way as well. Some other people go to the elevators, and a couple of elevator operators help ferry a lot of them down, especially one of them, a guy named Joey Zito, who is considered the hero of this story. And he continues to ferry people down in his elevator until eventually the women waiting on the 9th floor are so scared that they pry open the doors of the elevator and start jumping down the elevator shaft. Most of them die, and it disables the elevator, so Joey Zito can't save any more lives. Other people go to a different door, to a different stairwell, and they can't open it. There's a little bit of controversy about this, but most historians believe that the door was locked because it had been locked on many other days. It was locked largely to keep workers from walking out that way and stealing garments or fabric, and also to keep labor organizers from sneaking in and trying to organize them. Some people think that people just rushed up to the door and the door opened inward and they were all packed against the door and couldn't get it open, but that's sort of a minority view. Most people think that it was locked on purpose. And then other people who have nowhere to go start jumping out the windows. This is in the middle of Greenwich Village, just a block east of Washington Square Park. It's a heavily populated area, and people are there watching the fire. And when the first people start jumping, people on the ground think they're throwing bales of clothing out the window to protect the clothing, and then they realize it's people. The fire department is there as well, and they've got some nets with them. They've tried to raise the ladder. The ladder does not reach up to the 9th floor. They can't get the fire out that way. So they open up their nets, and one woman jumps and drops into the net, but the force of her fall pulls the net out of their hands. And she hits the ground, and she stands up and walks a few steps, and then falls over dead. Other people start jumping, sometimes in 2s and 3s, holding hands. The last thing they ever do, and all the police and the firemen could do, is to move the onlookers out of the way, so that no one will let it. One of the people who's standing in that crowd, watching what's going on, is a woman named Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins was an activist who had been involved in allying consumer groups with labor groups to help support workers. And when she saw this happen, she decided she needed to do something about it. And she called up her state representative, a guy named Al Smith, and said, we need to do something to make sure that this never happens. And they, along with another state legislator named Robert Wagner, create a commission to tour the entire state looking at labor conditions to make sure that they can make some suggestions to the state legislature to pass laws so that something like this will never happen again. And they're very successful with this. They pass a lot of laws. Laws that say things like, don't smoke cigarettes in a factory. All factories must have sprinkler systems, and sprinkler systems were available back then. Blank & Harris were just too cheap to install. In fact, Blank & Harris also had a bunch of insurance on the lives of all of those workers, and they ended up making a profit on the front end. Other laws said things like all doors must swing outwards so that no one can ever pile up against a door during a panic, be unable to open it. And all factories and other public places must have illuminated exit signs, like the one you see over there. The history of that sign dates back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. All of these laws get passed at the state level and begin to make things a little bit safer. But legislation means nothing without enforcement. And the enforcement's not going to happen without a strong union. And the ILG, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, uses this opportunity to build support for the labor movement and for enforcing all of these laws. And they were helped in that by another strike that had happened in between the 1909 strike and the fire in 1911. In 1909, when the women and the people who made women's clothing went on strike, they asked the other union, the amalgamated, the people who made men's clothing, and were mostly men, to go on strike with them, and the men refused. A failure of solidarity. But then in 1910, they went on strike themselves. And when their strike happened, the government stepped in and forced a compromise in which they created an entirely new structure of governing for the work that was going on in all of these factories. They created what are called tripartite commissions. The idea was, if you have a conflict with your boss, instead of going on strike or using sabotage or whatever else, you bring your complaint to the tripartite commission. And they are kind of like a jury or a set of judges who have representatives from the boss's side, representatives from the union side, and representatives from the government. Those are the three parts of the tripartite structure. And because the government, by 1910, had gotten involved in negotiating and sitting side by side with labor organizers, once the fire happens, there's more familiarity between them, and there's more willingness to work together. So the unions grow stronger, and they work alongside the government. And these tripartite commissions become pretty strong and work pretty well through the 19-teens. They collapse in the 1920s. But all of the people who've been involved in creating the laws and the structures, people like Frances Perkins, people like Robert Wagner, people like Al Smith's protege, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, eventually make it to Washington, D.C. in the 1930s, where they take all of those state laws and they recreate them as federal laws. The safety laws, but also the tripartite structure of these tripartite commissions is sort of remade with the National Labor Relations Act, which creates the National Labor Relations Board, which is another form of a bureaucracy that's going to settle disputes between workers and bosses so that we don't have to settle it with violence and we can avoid strikes. And for many years, it's wildly successful. The power of workers gets much stronger. And people within those unions, the amalgamated, Sidney Hillman is the president at the time, and the ILG, David Dubinsky, become very important members of the Democratic Party. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt does not do a lot of things without checking in with them first. They become important Cold War warriors. They're pretty anti-communist, especially David Dubinsky, and that creates some tension within the union because a lot of people in the ILG had been communist. But they're also bringing a lot of institutional power to labor unions and continuing to partner with government and, to a certain extent, with businesses throughout this period. There's a lot of different ways that they do this. One of my favorites happens in 1944 when a school called Fashion Institute of Technology is created. And it's created in partnership between business, labor, and the government. Business, they want it because they want to train more people to become the fashion designers, the business managers. They want a more steady stream of new employees for management stuff. The union, they want it because they think that if we educate the children of garment workers to become garment bosses, they're going to be a lot nicer to the next generation of workers. It turns out that dream totally failed. Instead of being nicer to the workers, they shipped all the jobs overseas where conditions are even worse. There are other things that happened in this sort of combination between labor, business, and the government. And the South, a housing development that's right across the street from FIT. Not so much business, but labor and government come together to create a new way of housing people that's going to be a lot more affordable and allow people to live within walking distance of their jobs in the garment district. And they also set aside some of the apartments in Penn South, which opens at the beginning of the 1960s, for labor activists and civil rights activists. One of the people who moves into Penn South is a guy named Bayard Rustin, who's the guy who taught Martin Luther King all about civil disobedience and all that Gandhi. Very soon after he moves in, Bayard Rustin and a bunch of other people decide they're going to create a march on Washington. He and A. Philip Randolph, who actually didn't live in Penn South at the time, but later moved in also. And in a matter of months, the labor movement and the civil rights movement come together to create this march for jobs and freedom. A lot of people forget the jobs part, forget the labor movement's involvement. That's true even at FIT. We have a building that faces Penn South called the Dubinsky Building. David Dubinsky, president of the union. And none of my students know who he is. None of my colleagues know who he is. It's a little bit discouraging. But when we had the anniversary of the March on Washington in 2023, we tried to publicize a little bit more, so maybe a few more people know that. So we have a lot of things that grow out of this history. One, we've got mass manufacture of clothing. And looking around this room, I'm guessing that all of you have taken advantage of that. We have a lot more factory safety than we used to have, although we're always in danger of moving backwards on that, and we have to be really vigilant about that. We have, at one time, a strong labor movement, which then collapsed, especially from the 1970s and 80s, but maybe about to grow again, because when we do surveys, it seems that the labor movement is more popular than it's been since the middle of the 20th century. Not everybody wants a union for themselves, but upwards of 70% of Americans in the last year, when surveyed, have said that they are in favor of the labor movement. These are astronomical numbers, and they need to be taken advantage of. And then the last thing that we have that I want to point out is a model for business and labor and the government to work together, not as antagonists, but as partners, to build affordable education, to build affordable housing, to build a city and a world in which it's a little bit easier to get by. And these are all lessons that have been forgotten, but that we can learn again. And I hope that we will. And I hope that some of you learned a little bit from what I said, and that you can bring that to other people in the future. Thank you very much. Questions?
Yes.
Should we hold up the collective ribbon?
There's a
Also
few
talk about
things we
that?
should do.
Oh, we got a lot of stuff. Okay, so first thing, we didn't bring enough for everybody because it was too heavy. But we have a book that we published about the making of the Triangle Fire Memorial. This beautiful work, which are we going to unveil?
Yeah, this is a rendition of what this is the third of 5 renditions of what we thought the Triangle Fire Memorial would look like.
It looks even better than that.
It's pretty close to this, but there are some differences. Like, for example, the weight of the steel, as they had originally thought of here, was to hang from the 9th floor, where Professor Levinson Wilk described to you where most of the victims from the fire died. It was too heavy to hang. So when you go there, and I hope you will, and Dan will talk about how to get to see the memorial, it's attached at various points. Obviously, a memorial like this needs to be very safe and not hurt anyone. So this is just, I was hiding it for now because I didn't want to spoil Dan's talk. And
It is very distracting.
and then this is a little bit of a rendition about what it looks like when you come to experience it. It's somewhat different the way it turned out, but please do come up and take a look at this if it entices you to come and experience the Triangle Fire Memorial yourselves.
It really is amazing.
Yeah, so it's the sun shines down and it reflects in a piece of black stone glass, which is stone and glass. So if you,
Sherry Kane's on her right too.
so when you go to look at it, you'll see the names reflected in the stone glass. It's very beautiful.
I have seen it as
It's
I walk
so-
by,
I'll tell you that.
and it is utterly stunning.
Think of any questions you may have for Professor Levinson Wilk, and I'll come over and bring the microphone to you.
All right, let me just say one other thing. We have this book here. We don't have enough for everybody, but I don't want to walk home with any of them. So come get me after the talk if you would like one of these books.
It's a commemorative book. It's actually just been assessed by the Library of Congress. We didn't print more. It's just what we have. We printed 5,000 and there's only about 1,000 left. So if you'd like to have something that's truly a historic record of what we did to get this memorial done, you can certainly come talk to Dan afterwards.
We also have cards on the table over here inviting you to our annual memorial, which is going to be on March 25th, the anniversary of the fire. It's always an incredibly moving event. For me, the most moving part, for a lot of people I think, is when the fire truck raises its ladder to demonstrate that it couldn't make it all the way up there. And this is going to be our first memorial since everything was installed. So it's going to be an incredibly important one for us this year. It's on March 25th from 11:30 to 1. We've got
Please
cards
come
over
and
there.
lay a flower.
And you can lay a flower we have a flower for each person who died.
If you don't mind talking to us.
Could you please talk a little bit about Clara Levitt? Tell us more about her.
Sure. I mean, she was a Spitfire, right? She was one of this generation of young women who immigrated to the United States and became very involved in labor organizing. And she had been at the forefront of the early part of the strike in 1909, had been a picketer during the period when the goons were coming for the picketers. They beat her bloody. She was in the hospital for several days with broken bones. and got herself out of the hospital to go to that meeting at Cooper Union to make sure that she could rouse the troops to create this strike. And there was a real both age and gender divide within the union between the leadership and the management. The leadership was older and largely male. The membership was younger, largely Italian and Jewish. Well, they were all Italian and Jewish, but largely younger and female. And these young women, they weren't going to take no for an answer. They were not subservient. They were going to lead this movement. And she was the most important, I think, in that generation of female garment organizers.
And I can say that she continued to be an activist her whole life. I understand that even when she was in the retirement home, she was organizing the workers there. Oh, Robin Burson also on our board.
Yeah, we're all over the place. I just want to point out briefly, I'll try to be brief, there's a very direct connection with this building and the strike. This was a courthouse before it was a library. And this was where, when the goons were arresting the girls, this is where they brought them to be sent off to the women's prison. The bail was set at $3, it was a week's rent, they couldn't do it. And there was a young, very wealthy German socialist labor activist, German-American activist, named Carola Vershoff. Her grandmother edited the leading German socialist newspaper in New York, which I'm not going to come to say again. But Carola was a Spitfire herself, and she stood outside the library. For these girls, these Italian and Orthodox Jewish girls, getting arrested, getting sent to the women's prison was a nightmare. It was a shame, even though they should have been proud of it. And there's no way they could have paid the bail. No, I'm just talking about the building. I'm sorry, am I going out to
No, I wondered if you had a question.
No, I just want to identify what's important about the building. Carola stood outside with her own money. Her mother gave her and brought cash to her. She stood outside and handed out $3, $2, $4 at a time, $75,000 during, and we're talking 1910. And she saved a lot of those girls from the trauma. She was also, actually, I think she chaired the factory investigating committee afterwards. And the tragedy is that she was driving her own heavy automobile in 1911 upstate New York to go to a migrant workers camp, and it overturned and she was killed in 1986. You're welcome. But that's the building.
Questions? Okay, I'll come around that way.
Can you speak to why the tripartite commissions failed in the 1920s?
I think that in general, the 1920s were a more anti-union environment from the federal government on down. President Coolidge was a real pro-business kind of guy. And as the culture changed, a lot of bosses thought, we can get away with more. We don't need to do this anymore. And I think that that's generally true of any shift in the power or weakness of labor. Ultimately, it comes down to culture. And we can point at lots of different reasons or moments why the labor movement has been really weak recently. People often point to the PATCO strike in 1981 when Ronald Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers as a really important moment. But I think that sometimes we get hung up on events, we get hung up on moments. And it's really a broader cultural shift that causes the moments. And that culture grows out of like how we all feel and what we say to each other. So we do have some power over that.
Thank you very much. So can you speak to what happened to the owners of the business besides getting very rich?
So,
and one other quick question is did Frances Perkins just happen to be walking by?
she was having tea down the block and she heard the hubbub and went out to see what was happening right off of Washington Square Park. And of course, I've already forgotten the first question, which was really important.
What happened to the
Oh, what happened to him? Yes. Okay. So first of all, there's a trial. They go on trial. There is one victim who is picked out as the exemplar, and there's a lot of testimony, which is all available for you to read if you would like on a Cornell website. If you search Cornell Triangle Factory Fire, you can see their beautiful website, which has transcripts of all the testimony, or a lot of it at least. And when the judge charges the jury, he charges in a very narrow way, making it very difficult for the jury to find them guilty. And it all turned on the question of whether that door was locked, and they are acquitted. They then make a lot of money off of the insurance, as I said, and they move a little bit further uptown and open up another factory. Government inspectors come through a couple of years later. All the doors are locked again.
Oh, no.
One of them, the daughter, or not daughter, the descendant of blank, but her last name is actually Harris, which is a little strange, is now an artist who makes sometimes art related to the Triangle Fire, Susan Harris. So there is some sense of understanding of that history within the family.
Thank you. I think another theme that stands out to me is the connection with the immigration story
Yeah.
of so many people. And I know you touched on this in passing, and I believe Blank and Harris themselves were immigrants too. So I would love to hear your perspective on that. I mean, so many people fleeing terrible conditions to then find themselves in this situation.
Absolutely. First of all, this is a very common story where immigrants are oppressing other immigrants, right? We are sometimes surprised by that, but we shouldn't be. When you get ahead a little bit, it's time to take advantage of the people who came after you. And there's also, even within the Jewish community, beyond that, a broader split between the German Jews who immigrated earlier and the Russian Jews who come later. The German Jews oppress the Russian Jews, are embarrassed by the Russian Jews, try to reform the Russian Jews so that they won't bring shame on the entire community. It creates a really weird dynamic. In addition to that, there's a lot of Italian people who are working in this factory, but the bosses are not Italian, so in a sense, the Italians are maybe even more vulnerable. The story of America is the story of immigration. All of the people working in these cities are immigrants. By the late 1800s, 80 to 90% of the population of most major cities in America are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. So when we think about, panics about immigration today, nothing compared to the waves of immigration that were coming over and flooding the cities. And the same sorts of paranoia that we see today, we saw back then. Lots of anti-immigrant reactions, which eventually find their way into law in the 1920s with the Immigration Restriction Acts. Maybe we will figure out again at some point what we figured out back in the day, that immigrants are ultimately great for America. They were built America. One of the things that I try to teach my students in particular is that there's a paranoia around immigrants creating crime. And I don't have statistics for that time period. But for today, we know that immigrants actually are a force for decreasing crime consistently. Because the people who come here are less likely to want to commit crime, they want to work. They are afraid of getting kicked out of the country, so that leads them to be a little bit more careful. And also, they repopulate areas of cities where other people have left, often because of suburbanization in the last half of the 20th century. So if you look at New York today, it's doing a lot better than it was in the 70s, and that's because of immigrants. Because when everybody else was fleeing, the immigrants were coming, and they were rebuilding the fabric of society. So it's horrifying to see how immigrants are being treated today, but it's also dismaying to see how people don't understand the history and the import that immigrants bring into society.
Other questions?
Oh, sorry, I'll make my way up front.
I just wanted to let everyone know that there was an artist for a long time by the name of Ruth Serval who started a project called Chalk, and every year she would have volunteers.
Still doing it.
Actually, the Tenement Museum is doing it.
Very good.
She's passed the torch. But it was a fascinating, it's a fascinating thing to do. They researched the names and the addresses of all of the factory workers who died. And every year an army of volunteers goes out and chalks the name of the person, their age, and that they died in the fire. And if you're interested in helping out, it's at the, as I said, the tenement, contact them at the Tenement Museum.
And I want to say also, it's really important that they put the age, because the ages are so young, 14 years old in a lot of cases. And also, in addition to founding Chalk, Ruth founded our organization, the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition.
That's right.
And it was created as the anniversary, the centennial was coming up. First, to just coordinate events, because so many people were creating commemorations. So we wanted to have a place where people could know what was going on, in part so that we didn't cross schedule, you know, we didn't want to have a lot of really great events on the same night. And then once that anniversary was over, I would say it's mostly Rose, who was like, what are we going to do next? We built this organization, let's do something with it.
Well, that was Ruth also.
And that's what this grew into.
Okay, I'll make my way up front here. So I can do a detour here and then.
Oh, and Ruth will be speaking at the event.
Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet member. She was appointed by FDR. My question is, do we know whether it was FDR who supported her appointment most or Eleanor?
I would guess Eleanor had something to do with it. But FDR really was the protege of Al Smith, who had also run for president and lost. And he had worked so closely with Frances Perkins that she was part of this community. I don't think that she needed Eleanor to get the job.
Two-part question. What was the floor plan? How large was each floor?
Big.
Roughly. And were there men also who died in this fire?
There were some men who died. I can't give you the square footage, but it's like, goes halfway down the block on either side. But another thing to keep in mind about the floor plan is that they were huge rooms with really long tables, which had a lot of sewing machines on them, and it was hard to get through. So when people are fleeing from the fire, it's very hard even to get to the elevator, let alone try to get down the elevator. And some of the regulations are also about egress, right? We need to have passageways that will allow people to escape, because when it's too crowded in, that's really hard.
And I can also say, if you like next, we have some great photo blow-ups in the back. If you haven't had a chance to look at them, we'll keep the space open for another hour. Do take a look. These have been blown up from the archives at the Kiel Center. They hold the quintessential repository, I guess, for the ILGWU, so you can learn more through them. We've learned a lot and partnered with them as the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition. So, and you can see the size of the factory floor maybe by looking at some of those photos too.
You mentioned about sending, with the decline of the unions and the 1944, I think, was the year
That FIT was founded.
that FIT was founded. And I perceived the link of 1944 with sending the work overseas. But my general
No, it's a little bit
understanding was
later.
what later. Was there a particular catalyst, and when would you say it
For
was
sending things overseas?
And what was the timing of it?
I'm going to give you an answer that maybe not everybody would agree with. I think the catalyst for sending everything overseas is the invention of the shipping container. The shipping container, you guys know what these are. They're a standard size. You can take it off a ship and put it on a flatbed, That is an incredible game changer for bringing things in and out of ports. Because all of a sudden, all of the stevedores, all the shore, the workers, you don't need them anymore. A lot of them lose their jobs. And it's much cheaper to just unload it shipping container by shipping container and then ship it to some distribution site far away from New York and unload it. That savings in money makes international trade a lot cheaper. But I would also say that we don't always calculate that so well. So there's an assumption once that happens, and all right, we're going to save some money, that shipping all these jobs overseas is just going to be cheaper because the labor is so much cheaper over there. Corporations will calculate almost any business decision down to the dime. But some historians have searched this and found that when it comes to the question of should we outsource it, they're not looking that closely at the numbers. And if they did, they might have found that actually there are a lot of losses when you ship from overseas, not just the cost of transportation, but the cost of communication being so much more difficult. Being in a different time zone means that it takes a week to have a conversation. Not being able to walk down the street to the factory means so much less oversight. And so if we look really closely at the numbers, we find that, yeah, maybe it's a little cheaper to make it overseas, but not as cheap as we think. And that maybe bringing a lot of this manufacturing back to America would be totally profitable. There's another story that some people give about why it all got shipped overseas, which is that labor racketeering and organized crime pushed up the cost of manufacturing here. And there's a little bit of truth to that as well. But I think that the shipping container and the assumption that cheaper labor will lead to lower costs were more important than not. We're talking the 1970s, the 1980s. In the 60s, there was still a lot of clothing being manufactured in the United States. And then it starts to decline.
I have a two-part question.
Okay.
And then we'll go back to.
That's why you're sitting down.
Yeah, that's why I'm sitting down. I'm a person asking a question now. People do ask me, why was it important to build a memorial like this to the Triangle workers and to the legacy of what happened? Why was the memorial important? So I wanted to hear your answer to that. And then I wanted to hear you talk about how the community got involved in helping to build it. So.
All right. Why is it important? It's hard for me to answer that because it feels so obvious to me, but I will let you know what I really think. I just got an email earlier today from my friend Lulu Lolo, who is a performance artist and is on the board of the Triangle Fire Coalition. She was sorry she couldn't make it. She sometimes gets dressed up as Joan of Arc and stands on street corners with a sign that says, "Where are the women?" Because there are very, very few monuments to women in New York. There are a few more since the since the de Blasio administration, because there was an effort to put up some more statues to women. But there are still very few, and there are very, very few dedicated to workers, to the labor movement. In fact, I was involved with a website that is mapping around the world monuments to labor leaders, labor unions, labor events, and there just aren't that many of them. So we need to create more recognition in the city streets of the contributions of women and of workers. Sometimes I feel conflicted about this because I walk by statues and I don't pay attention to them sometimes, and I'm a historian, I should be paying attention. So I wonder, what difference does it make? But I think that our memorial is different because it's so striking. It's that we like to say it's the first vertical memorial. It's not a statue of somebody who you might walk by. So we really hope that it will become something that's not ignored when people walk by it. I also have this dream that it's going to become a place where people gather. So the next time that there's an industrial disaster somewhere in the United States or somewhere in America, I hope that people will come here to be able to talk to each other and mourn with each other and decide what we do next. So I think it's important for that reason also. The community coming together, I mean, frankly, Rose, you could answer that question better than I could. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
to break it up. And then, is it over here, the question? Okay, great. And then I'll come back. Yes, our designers came up with the idea when we were stalled because NYU was keeping the paperwork stuck in legal, and we couldn't build on their building. They own that building. It's a privately owned, publicly landmarked building. We came through the Landmarks Preservation Commission with flying colors, 100% approval, unanimous, after a very heated debate that went on with the neighbors in the neighborhood there who did not want, you know, a NIMBY, not in my backyard. They didn't want the memorial because it would create more traffic. That's a whole other story.
And they were all like lefty people, you know, pro-labor. They just didn't like the idea of people coming through, and that they were afraid that the vertical element would reflect light into their windows, which was a legitimate concern, which we addressed.
Yes. Yeah, they redesigned it a few times to meet several obstacles. But our designers said, look, as long as we're stalled, as long as we have to wait for the wheels of bureaucracy to move very, very slowly as they do in New York City, why don't we get the community involved? And they came up with this idea to embed people's memories into that 9-story tall ribbon. Well, now how are you going to do that? They came up with this idea. Maybe Dan can help them. Sherry, you want to help lift up a piece of it? They came up with a long strip of canvas, and we started it at FIT on long rows of tables. And you can see it on our website, remember the trianglefire.org. And people came with their family's memorabilia. They came with their union memorabilia. People mailed in fabric from Europe that was their grandmother's kerchief. They sewed in their personal memories as a worker, as a woman, as an immigrant. And this piece that we can only partially unfurl here is 1/5 of all of it. I mean, it stretches, you can imagine the length that this had to stretch all the way up the 9 stories and all the way back and then down on the horizontal. So once this was all sewn into a canvas that was this wide, this is
a picture of it.
This is a picture of
This is
it,
an
yeah.
actual picture.
We actually had drones that came and took pictures of the entire thing. It fills up an entire auditorium. They took this canvas to Ohio where it was acid etched into the metal, into that metal. And you can see a tiny little piece of it in our pop-up exhibit. So after we finish with the Q&A, feel free to go ahead and touch it. So imagine when you think of it, this was a new technology actually that they figured out even after we started this whole project. So that if somebody sewed in, let's say a ribbon, it had 3-dimensional qualities to it. You can see it raised, and I don't really understand how they did it, but there are some people in here maybe who are more experienced in what etching is all about. So we left it on the floor here, we can figure out how to hang it. So you can come take a peek at it.
And one of the things we haven't done yet, but we'd like to do, is create an app where if you put your phone up and zoom in on a piece of that ribbon, up will pop the story of the person who sewed it in, and
So
a
when
picture
we-
of the
yeah.
original.
When we were doing it, everybody who brought something in wrote why they brought that in. You know, who they were, what it meant to them, and what it meant, why they brought it to the triangle.
We have time for a couple more questions. I saw a hand here and a hand back there.
If you try to remember my question. I have 2 questions. One is, first of all, congratulations on the memorial. I didn't know, so I'm glad that I found out about it.
Y'all can walk over when you leave here, it's not too far away.
You mentioned that many of the workers that were in the factory were immigrants and young people, and I was wondering if they were in the union, if you could talk a little bit about that dynamic. And then also the impact of conditions for workers in the U.S. that you mentioned. I wonder if similar safety precautions were put into place worldwide as an impact of this disaster.
So in answer to the first question, the strike in 1909 starts at the Triangle Factory, so a lot of them are unionized then. They all lose their jobs. Other places where they sign the contract, they got to bring the strikers back in. They don't. It doesn't happen at Triangle. So by the time of the fire, there's actually a lot less union density on the floor of that particular factory. It's one of the least well-organized shops in the city. In terms of the global impact, I was at an event at the Ford Foundation almost a decade ago about garment safety around the world. And 2 representatives of the Bangladeshi government had come from DC up to New York, and they gave a speech in which they talked about the Triangle Fire. Now, to me, that was a little bit of window dressing, because the government of Bangladesh is not very good at protecting workers' rights. But it is the symbol internationally. It's also become a really important symbol in Italy, where a lot of those workers came from. Joey Zito, who I was talking about before, the hero elevator operator, came from a town called Serra, which is not so far from Napoli. And that town didn't know anything about his heroism. His cousins were still living there. But they didn't know until about a decade ago, when they started getting word about it, and now they teach it in the schools. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to this town a couple of years ago and meet with one of Joe Zito's relatives, who told us this story about how we didn't know. It was just they were the people who left. And now there's a plaque up on the house where he grew up, dedicated to it. So the word spreads, and I think that it is internationally the most important symbol of workers' tragedy in industrial accidents and the need for worker safety.
It's come to be known as the fire that changed America.
So just one question, in 1911, was there any obligation or pressure to compensate the families of the victims? So no one was?
No, the bosses make money.
Yeah.
Robin, am I wrong?
That much.
I'm a little wrong.
1%. There was a civil suit brought against the owners, and they had to pay $75 to each family. They cleared like $400 per victim.